Welcome to this session, the last session with regards to the Doctors in Training Enterprise Agreement. The purpose of today really is to focus on the changes arising from the new agreement. We received a log of claims in November 2016. It had 69 claims in total, 23 of which were specific to doctors in training. Some of those claims were ones that matched claims that we, VHA, were making. Some of the claims were ones that we had seen before with other agreements during the bargaining process, and some were quite unique and novel. The slides for today are available from the VHA website. If you log into that website and go to the My page and open up the landing page for the Doctors in Training Agreement, there you will find the expired agreement, the new agreement as lodged, these presentation slides, as well as implementation materials, and those implementation materials include the implementation guide that will assist you to implement the changes arising from this agreement. We'll be referring to some terms quite regularly, including NES, that stands for the National Employment Standards under the Fair Work Act, the minimum legislated standards below which we cannot go, and the 4 stages of bargaining, which is a process that we have at VHAA so that we can subject our agreements to a continuous improvement process. The 4 stages of bargaining are bargaining, implementation, review and planning. They're not to be confused with the 5 stages of grief, although there is some overlap. This is the first step that we undertake in terms of implementation, but it will not be the last. We will develop a list of implementation items. They will be then added to our implementation item tracker, which is a process that we've applied to all of our agreements in this round. Those list of implementation issues will be something that we report on each month as we undertake additional activities to support you through the implementation process under this agreement. There are some themes with regards to this agreement in particular, one of which is a focus on dealing with gender equity issues, in particular how those issues intersect with the use of fixed term contracts. That's really an issue that affects this group in a way that does not affect any other group. So for those who were at this morning's session, they know the answer to this question. So I guess my question may be to you, but if you went to the Melbourne session, you may still know the answer, 1,300. It represents the number of hours spent with regards to this agreement and the medical specialist agreement. That's a high number of hours to negotiate. It took a longer period of time than some other agreements. Those who are responsible for the nurses and midwives agreement might recall that agreement in principle was reached within 5 weeks of the nominal expiry date. This took longer. In terms of that period of time, it was comprised of some 70-odd bargaining meetings, about 12 reference group meetings that participated in the bargaining process. For those of you who aren't familiar with our reference groups, those are comprised of volunteers, people who give up their time to be available to participate during the bargaining process. Our process is better for the participation of those people who volunteer, and I would like to publicly thank those people who participated in the reference groups. Their contribution, their advice and their patience was greatly appreciated by us. I'd also like to thank those people who made their contribution by posting a question or posting content through the VHA Community app. If you're not familiar with the app, this is the means by which we communicate what's happening in bargaining as we go along. These agreements are the first agreements where we have summarised each bargaining meeting. That means that we're giving you real-time updates as to what's occurring in bargaining. It gives people an opportunity to participate in the bargaining process in a way that has not previously been possible. Instructions with regards to how to download the app are available through the website. If you have any difficulties at all in terms of password access, please don't hesitate to contact us. But as we go forward, we will be doing updates in terms of the service delivery partnership plan through the app and any other development, including implementation tools. For those of you who are responsible for other agreements, it will be the primary tool by which we update you as we go for bargaining from this point on. This agreement is not yet in effect. It will not take effect until 7 days after it is approved by a member of the Fair Work Commission. You can see from the screen that it's been some time since the agreement was lodged. The Fair Work Commission has indicated that it is taking longer than its benchmark time of 12 weeks to approve agreements. That time is longer than it used to be, which suggests that the process for approval is very, very in depth at this point. We have had correspondence from the Fair Work Commission and we are putting together a reply to that correspondence, but in doing so we are consulting with the AMA with a view to seeking to reach agreement with regards to that response, and we hope to get agreement with regards to that response sooner rather than later. It does pose us some interesting challenges with regards to this group in particular, in that the longer it goes on, then the more change may have occurred with regards to this working group, particularly when you take into account the fact that some of the obligations arise from the 1st of January, and this group will likely have changed employers since that time, but it is something we are mindful of, and we'll turn our mind to some further advice on that. The agreement structure has been changed. One of the interesting things about the previous agreement is some of the substantive provisions were actually found in the definitions clause. So in other agreements we have a standalone provision with regards to a definition for full-time employment or casual employment. But in this instance they were there in the definitions provision. We've sought to take the same approach and pull them into the agreement proper. Similarly, things like parental leave and long service leave had some substantive provisions in the body of the agreement and an accompanying appendices. The problem with that approach is that the answer may not have been where you were looking for it. So we have consolidated those provisions into the body of the agreement, and broadly speaking we've tried to structure it the way that our other health agreements are structured. Over time what we are seeking to do is get greater commonality in terms of how our health sector agreements look and where you can find specific clauses so that you as practitioners can find the clause that you are looking for with greater ease. Part A covers the preliminary definitions, coverage, date and period of operation. This agreement expires on the 31st of December 2021. Please keep in mind as the fireworks begin that this agreement is then coming to an end. In terms of that date also matches the one for the specialists agreement, and this part also covers how this agreement interacts with other agreements and the national employment standards. With respect to definitions more broadly, where you see a term that is capitalised, that will be, the chances are that will be a defined term. Where that definition applies throughout the agreement, you will find that definition at clause 3. Where the definition is specific to a particular clause, then you will find the term defined within that particular clause. Just to draw to your attention a particular change, and it's an issue that arose during the life of the last agreement concerning those who worked a period of higher duties prior to permanent employment as a registrar. What this change at clause 3.1 makes clear is that experience in a higher duties role immediately prior to permanent employment as a registrar counts for experience. That definitional change is really about clarifying a provision that had been at times disputed under the last agreement. So Part B contains many of the common provisions. One of the things that we are seeking to do is get greater commonality on procedural matters between our various agreements. That's never been the case until now. That is still a work in progress, but over time we want it to be so that you have one discipline clause to administer rather than 7, one dispute settlement clause that you need to worry about instead of more than half a dozen. Starting with consultation, it is unlikely that this clause will have a lot of work to do with regards to this particular cohort. However, if you are not familiar with this provision, there are a couple of things for which you to be aware of. First of all, when it applies. This clause applies and you are obliged to follow it where there are 2 elements present, one of which is that the employer proposes a major change. The second necessary element is that the change may have a significant effect on the employees. Key terms including major change, and significant effect are defined at subclause 2. Also defined at subclause 2 is the term consultation. The definition of consultation is taken from a decision of the Australian Industrial Relations Commission. It is defined as a genuine opportunity to influence the decision maker but not joint decision making. Subclause 3 contains indicative timeframes for consultation around which you can build your process. Subclauses 4 to 9 set out the steps for consultation, that is the things you need to do to meet your obligation. And subclause 10, which is a standalone subclause which provides for consultation about changes to rosters and hours of work. Just to be clear, subclause 10 does not require that you go through the indicative timeframes or the steps at subclauses 4 to 9. It stands alone. It is a requirement of the Fair Work Act that we include that provision. So we have included that at subclause 10. There is more information with regards to the consultation clause. If it does arise as something that you do need to be familiar with, you can find that at our podcast series, episode 8. That is available both in a video format and an audio format. Just to be clear, the video format does have audio. It's not a case that it's without audio. The way to get to them is if you go to the VHA website, and on the right-hand side of the My IR page, you'll find VHA video links. All the podcast episodes are presented there. Clause 11 concerns redundancy. Again, this is unlikely to have a lot of work to do. Mostly speaking, it sets out the various entitlements that arise where you are making a significant change that may result in termination by way of redundancy. Previously, we've not had provisions like these in our agreements, or alternatively those provisions have been contained in organisational change agreements that lapsed sometime in the 1990s. One of the things we were keen to do is to get consistency not just within across health services but across agreements, and that's really the purpose of this particular provision. You can find more information with regards to the redundancy provision at episode 14 of the podcast series. Clause 12 provides a common approach to dispute resolution. It is the same clause that you'll find in other health sector agreements, save for the odd minor variation, which I'll come to in a moment. The first thing to consider if you do have a dispute is to turn your mind as to whether the dispute falls within the scope of the clause. You'll find the scope of the clause at subclause 1. It talks about disputes arising under this agreement, under the National Employment Standards, requests for flexible work arrangements, including requests to extend parental leave beyond 12 months. If a dispute is not about one of those things, then it does not fall under the dispute resolution clause. Subclause 2 also contains useful information for you. That is, it imposes an obligation on the parties to a dispute and their representatives to genuinely attempt to resolve a dispute under these procedures. Oftentimes we receive letters from representatives for employees that make a series of allegations but don't engage at all with that obligation. You can rely on that obligation in terms of your correspondence or if you are appearing at the Fair Work Commission. The discipline clause sets out the process for disciplinary procedures. It replaces the previous performance management protocol. There are two distinct components, one of which is an investigation process. That's the process by which an employer determines what, on the balance of probabilities, has happened, as well as the disciplinary process where the employer decides what outcome, if any, is appropriate, having regard for all the circumstances. Key terms are defined. Those terms include performance, misconduct and serious misconduct. The definition for serious misconduct is derived from the regulations of the Fair Work Act. It is an inclusive rather than exhaustive definition. In addition, the clause provides the circumstances under which you can utilise a first and final warning. That is, you can utilise a first and final warning only in the circumstance of serious misconduct, where, having regard for the circumstances, such as mitigating circumstances, you may wish not to terminate. More information is available at episode 16 of the podcast series. This clause incorporates the wording from the Fair Work Act, particularly Section 65. Section 65 is part of the National Employment Standards. If this clause had not been included in the agreement, these provisions would have applied anyway. The reason that we include them in the agreement is so that practitioners have the answers that they need in the document that they're using, rather than having to refer to an external document. What it provides is that an employee is entitled to request for flexible work arrangements in defined circumstances. You have to meet or fall within those defined circumstances to have that entitlement. There are two things you need to be aware of if you do receive such a request. One of which is that the only grounds for refusal are reasonable business grounds. That term is not particularly defined in a concrete fashion. It really does require a consideration of all the circumstances. One of the interesting things that we've been discussing at our monthly HR/IR meetings is in some work areas there have been a large number of requests under this provision, and in some circumstances it's possible that there may be a degree of saturation, which raises really interesting questions as to, from an equity point of view, how do you accommodate later requests from people? I don't think that's a circumstance that we face yet with doctors in training, but there is an interesting discussion to be had about these provisions across the agreements as time goes forward. The second thing to be mindful of is that there are 20 days to respond to such a request. If you do receive a request that you can't accommodate, we would strongly recommend that you meet with and engage with the person making the request. It may well be that through discussion you can come up with a mutually satisfactory flexible work arrangement. There is almost always a better answer than no. Further information with regards to flexible work arrangements are contained at episode 21. Clause 16 has a similar title, but it has a different job to do. An individual flexibility arrangement allows the parties to come up with arrangements to effectively override certain provisions of the agreement within a limited menu. In this case, the limited menu concerns arrangements about when hours are worked. That's the scope of the provision. It is different to a flexible work arrangement. This is generally, or oftentimes can be, at the initiative of the employee. There are rules around how these can be entered into and terminated. Every enterprise agreement must have a provision for an individual flexibility arrangement, so accordingly we have included it in this agreement. Part C covers doctor employment and modes of employment, periods of employment, responsibilities, rotation, orientation and termination. I think that the term modes of employment is one that will be familiar to anyone in people and culture from other agreements. We're talking about definitions for full-time, definitions for casual and the like. So starting with full-time employment. The definition of full-time employment has been moved from the definition section to make it its own standalone provision. There is a reference in the clause to a 43-hour week for registrars, which is made up of 38 hours of work and 5 hours training time. Substantively, this clause does not represent a change. It's been redrafted in terms of the way it appears, but substantively it remains as it was. Similarly, part-time employment has been moved from the definitions into the agreement itself as a standalone provision. There is no substantive change to that provision. One of the interesting things about the expired agreement is that it referred to casuals, but it didn't have a lot of information about how casual engagement worked for this group. So this is effectively a common casual employment clause, which is modelled on other public health sector agreements, which seeks to set out what the entitlements are and, just as importantly, what the entitlements are not with respect to casual employees. We don't have a lot of casual doctors in training. It won't have a lot of work to do, but we thought it was good to get consistency in terms of a set of rules. Similarly, casual conversion will not have a lot of work to do. This is a clause that will be familiar to people who are responsible for other agreements. It is a common clause. The general principle behind it, for those who aren't familiar with this provision, is that it enables those who have worked on a regular and systematic basis for 26 weeks or more, either the employer or the employee can request a conversion from casual to permanent employment. In terms of the hours, though, it's underpinned by the idea that the hours that are being worked don't belong to someone else. This is not a means by which to dispossess somebody who may be absent from the workplace because of parental leave or long service leave or for any other reason. It is a means to assign available hours where possible. It is unlikely to have much work to do for this group, but further information is available at episode 19. Clause 21, period of employment. This requires a little bit of discussion. There are a number of facets to this clause. What appears there on the screen are the provisions in the new agreement which actually reflect the provisions of the old agreement. That is, it maintains the existing arrangement of 1 to 3 year contracts. The second dot point there is that there will be a joint working party established to increase the minimum length of contract during the life of the agreement. One of the claims put forward by the AMA was to seek a minimum contract term of 2 years. We had feedback from our reference group that there were some challenges associated with that, which is why it's been directed into a process rather than an outcome. One of the interesting things about the request for 2 years is part of the reasoning was intended to address some of the issues and some of the inequities that arise from fixed-term contracts, including issues that arise from fixed-term contracts and things like parental leave. I mentioned at the outset that one of the themes for this particular agreement concerned gender equity issues. From our perspective, going to 2 year contracts reduces that problem rather than cures it. So there is another change with regards to clause 21, which is a new provision. And that is 21.3, the effect of certain absences on the period of employment. The previous agreement was completely indifferent to the way in which parental leave interacted with fixed-term contracts. It created a circumstance where those who proceed on parental leave could find that their employment within the sector comes to an end, and that is a problem that is experienced by only this group in large numbers. It's worth noting that more than 50% of doctors in training are women, and it was important to us and to the AMA to ensure that the new agreement described how those arrangements should work. So the changes that have been made here provide that if an employee is absent for 3 months, for more than 3 months because of parental leave, family violence leave or carers leave, that this subclause applies. In the case of parental leave, and before the parental leave commences, the health service shall offer to extend the contract by the period of leave. We'll return to the importance of the term offer shortly. The reason why there is an obligation to have that discussion before parental leave and not before the other kinds of leave is that unlike the other kinds of leave, you're a fair chance of knowing that you will require parental leave, and you will have a sense of how long you want to take on parental leave in terms of things like carers leave or family violence leave. There is likely to be an element of uncertainty. So just to go to an example, the doctor commences in February, has a contract to February of the following year. The doctor commences 12 months parental leave in September. Prior to commencing parental leave, the health service shall offer the doctor a variation to the contract. The variation provides for the doctor to extend the employment for the period of the 12 months of parental leave and return to work at the cessation of the parental leave and complete the remaining 5 months of their initial contract, representing the period between September and February that has not been completed prior to the absence on parental leave. The health service is required to make the offer. The doctor is not required to accept. It is open to the parties to reach an agreement with regards to some other length of time if they wish. But what it does do is it provides something of a safety net or a degree of certainty. The issues that arise from not having clarity and from having the employment come to an end if you are on parental leave and your employment comes to an end, you lose your sick leave. And that's something that no other person on parental leave experiences. You lose the benefits of continuity of service. And that's really the thing that we're trying to deal with these amendments. The majority of the work that this clause will have to do, by far and away, my sense would be in the parental leave space. That's the most work it will have to do.
Can I please ask, the word shall and you are advised to, is it really must?
Whereabouts?
Well, you said the health service shall offer, and just a moment ago you said you're advised to offer. Is it actually we must offer?
Yeah, the obligation is, so the question is whether or not there is a rock solid obligation to make the offer. Absolutely. There is the obligation to make the offer. There is...
I just always like the word must if you must.
There is flexibility though beyond that. So whilst the health service must make that offer, and we'll come to this example in a moment because I think it goes to that issue. Doctor commences in February, has a contract that ends in February the following year. The doctor commences 12 months parental leave in April. Prior to commencing parental leave, the health service must offer the doctor a variation to the contract. The doctor indicates that there is an intention to obtain employment next February and seeks not to have the contract extended as they intend on obtaining employment the following February. In that circumstance, the person is on parental leave until the effluxion at the end of their contract, and they will move on to the next health service. That is, the health service has met its obligation by making the offer. The doctor is entitled to ensure that they maintain alignment with other rotations as they do in that example. It will be interesting to see how this works in practice, and we'll be interested to get your feedback. What we were very keen to do is to make sure that something that was not addressed at all in the last agreement was addressed in this one. But as we gather feedback during the life of the agreement, we'll get a sense of what works well, what may require improvement. But certainly the intention is to ensure that people who take parental leave are not disadvantaged.
As a feminist, I think it's fantastic. As a person who may be involved in planning, it's really going to be really tricky, particularly if things aren't aligned with rotations. And you want to offer a junior doctor a year's rotations, and this is going to be quite difficult from that perspective. But all the intention is very good.
So I'll just repeat that for the benefit of the microphone, but I only heard the first half where you said it was fantastic. The point is well made. We're actually going to learn a bit, and it does sort of have a bit of an assumption here that doctors who use this clause and who need to use this clause will have an eye to things like rotation and rotation periods and what suits them as such, and they won't be indifferent to it as such. But we will learn and we will find out things as we go through. Is that a question as well?
If the doctor is, in this instance, the offer of 12 months is put to them and they say, no, I intend on moving on in February, are they allowed to change their mind?
Oh, great
3
question.
months into...
A person can always change their mind, but it means that
so what's the onus on the health service?
the employer has met its obligation at that point. It's done what it can. So rather than have it as a prescriptive outcome under those circumstances, you enter the realm of having a discussion and seeing whether or not you can get onto the same page or not. Generally speaking, there's generally goodwill around these things. Notwithstanding the fact that I said that the last agreement was completely indifferent to the intersection between fixed-term employment and parental leave, the fact is that the health services represented in this room have been taking a common sense approach wherever they can with regards to this issue for some time. What this is seeking to do is provide a basic prescribed minimum standard. It certainly doesn't prevent you from, in the event of a change of heart, from having the kind of conversations that you do now. But this just imposes an obligation at a point in time to make sure that we do have a prescribed, consistent minimum within our sector.
And sorry, just further to that.
Please.
Does the doctor need to indicate their intention in writing to the health service in regards to ending the 12 months, continuing the 12 months, or so leaving employment in February?
I'll just have, Daniel will just have a quick look at that provision to see whether it prescribes in writing. I would probably say, irrespective of whether it does or not, it would make sense for everyone to have that stuff clear and in writing. Parental leave generally is one of those really interesting issues where there's always so much goodwill, and at times people don't pay attention to the clarity of the arrangement. Leaving doctors aside, sometimes there are issues where people seek to return to work on a part-time basis upon return from parental leave, really common request. Every once in a while the parties forget to discuss whether the arrangement is temporary or permanent. So I think it's to everyone's benefit to clearly document whatever the arrangement is.
There's no guidance with respect to the clause.
So there's no express provision as to how it's done. You can use your best practice approach to ensure that you get what you need and that the doctor has certainty as well. There was a question here.
Is there any consideration for the type of role the doctor needs to go back into? For example, if they're a surgical HMO and there's gaps in other parts of the roster, do they need to go back into the same role that they were in? And also with specialty training positions as well, college accreditation considerations such as that.
We talked a little bit about colleges and the like, but we didn't want this provision to be hostage to getting clarity or agreement with the colleges. In terms of what role a person should come back to, general principle with regards to parental leave is that a person's entitled to come back to their pre-parental leave role. In the context of different specialty areas and the like, I think that's a little bit more nuanced. What I wouldn't mind doing is actually taking that on board and adding that to our implementation issue list, because it's a really practical question as to what is the pre-parental leave role in those circumstances, whether it is the same designation or whether it's the same work, when inbuilt into the idea of it is that people progress through different areas. Are there any other questions with regards to this provision? As I said, we are going to learn something from this clause, but from our perspective it was a really important change for us to make. All right. I will then hand over to Daniel Pullen, who is going to talk about rotation between hospitals and other matters. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Stuart, and good afternoon. So Clause 24 deals with rotation between hospitals. And one of the key themes, as I mentioned this morning, is that safe work and ensuring quality was one of the key items and key claims from the AMA. The Victorian public health system relies on the ability to rotate doctors in training through parent or rotation hospitals, and these agreements and arrangements will continue to operate. The clause has been amended to address occupational health and safety risks associated with two employment arrangements whose engagements are blind to the other. For example, the employment at the parent hospital and the employment at the rotation hospital. This agreement introduces, for the purpose of this clause, the terms Hospital 1 and Hospital 2, with Hospital 1 meaning the current employer of the doctor, Hospital 2 meaning the next employer of the doctor. Now, the change in terminology for this clause clarifies that a doctor may not simply rotate between a parent and a rotation hospital, and that some arrangements and rotation arrangements involve rotating between two rotation hospitals. In some circumstances, the rotation between employers results in expectations that create an unsafe pattern of work, especially associated with the period of transition between Hospital 1 and Hospital 2. The existing rotation from parent hospital clause has been amended to provide that where as part of a rotation arrangement, a doctor is required to move residents, then the doctor must be provided with a minimum of a whole calendar day clear from duty, and that includes on-call and overtime, or in the instance where the final shift was a night shift or their final shift was an on-call period, a period of 48 hours clear from duty between the end of their final shift or period of on-call at Hospital 1 and their first shift at Hospital 2. The clause also provides guidance that requires two hospitals to engage and cooperate to ensure that a doctor is not required to perform unsafe hours as a result of their rotation. And it also ensures that the maintenance of on-call and skill mix coverage is contemplated when entering into these arrangements. Now, we have provided a recent podcast with respect to this clause, and that is found at episode 65. We have an example here with our friend Dr. Dre, who is here at Eastern Hospital. Dr. Dre's last shift at Hospital 1 is a night shift, and it finishes at 7 a.m. on Sunday morning. Dr. Dre is required to move residents as a consequence of his rotation to Hospital 2. As his last shift at Hospital 1 was a night shift, and he's required to move residents, he is required to have 48 hours break before performing work at Hospital 2. The earliest Dr. Dre can perform work at Hospital 2 is 7 a.m. on Tuesday morning. The second example is Dr. Gray, and her last shift at Hospital 1 is an afternoon shift, and it finishes at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night. She's required to move residents as a consequence of her rotation to Hospital 2. Her last shift was not a night shift, but she was required to move residents. She's required to have 1 calendar day clear from duty before performing work at Hospital 2. So the earliest Dr. Gray can perform work at Hospital 2 would be any time on Monday onwards. Now, if a doctor is rotated, but they are not required to move residents as a result of that rotation, this clause does not apply. So any questions with respect to rotation between hospitals? Plenty of questions. You were just a little bit quicker. So
Where the final shift is a night shift or an on-call shift,
Yep.
if that on-call shift finishes at 9 p.m,
Yep.
that's then 48 hours clear,
Yep.
even if they're not called in.
Correct. Yeah.
Thank you.
So any further questions with respect to rotation? Yes.
Is the onus on the current or the rotating hospital?
With respect to the
cover?
relationship. So it's a good question. So one thing that the slide touches on very briefly, and so do the notes, but the clause provides a very, very detailed process by which before the final roster is issued for Hospital 1, Hospital 1 and Hospital 2 have to talk to each other about how the transition is going to occur. There's a list of items that can be contemplated, which includes skill mix, proper on-call coverage and the like. But it's up to the hospitals, both hospitals, to manage that transition. It can't be left the responsibility of the doctor to ensure that the employer rosters or two employers arrange their transition in a safe manner. It's the responsibility of both the hospitals to ensure that transition is safe. Now that may mean that because Hospital 1 is a major metropolitan hospital and Hospital 2 is a regional hospital, that the major metro may be able to afford to release the doctor a little bit earlier so that doctor can make it up to the regional centre in time to perform work. But that is about the discussion between the two parties. It may be that both are regional hospitals and there needs to be some discussion about how that's arranged. But what the clause requires is there to be a discussion and engagement between the two hospitals prior to the final roster being issued. Some of the scenarios that were put to us by the AMA, which through discussion with our reference group are relatively accurate, is that Hospital 1 may require the doctor to be on call on the Sunday night into Monday morning, finishing their on-call period at 7 a.m. Their first shift at Hospital 2 is their orientation that starts at 8 a.m. that morning, but that hospital is 250 kilometres away from that employer. The doctor can't leave Hospital 1 because of the on-call period and is required at Hospital 2 for an 8 a.m. orientation. In the absence of a discussion, both of those requirements are blind to Hospital 1 and Hospital 2. The introduction of this clause ensures that a discussion occurs. It may be that the hospital that requires the doctor to do the on-call shift, being Hospital 1, doesn't require them to do that on-call shift that evening and they can make other arrangements and release the doctor without the need for that shift. It may also be that Hospital 2 doesn't require them to attend orientation that morning and may be able to provide them some access to orientation later in that week. But it's a discussion that would have to occur and it's something that is new to the agreement, but it's something that we agree, and the reference group agreed needs to be placed in there to ensure that OH&S is addressed. Yes.
So, Eastern Health, we've got a big catchment, so we move doctors obviously all over the place.
Mhm.
So sometimes the doctor elects to move themselves to be closer because of transport issues. Does this clause come into effect for that?
Well, I think it would, look, it's a case by case. A good example would be if a doctor was a registrar at Casey Hospital, Monash Health's Casey Hospital, which is in Berwick, and they're rotated from Monash to Warrigal Base Hospital, it's about a half an hour's drive. It may be that in that circumstance they're not required to move residents, but they might do so because they prefer to live on campus at Warrigal Hospital. The clause provides that they're required to move residents as a result, but if that doctor is working in a role that they are the standalone registrar at that hospital, it's going to be very difficult for them to be, coming back from the end of a shift but being on call and being, over half an hour away from that hospital. So again, it's that discussion that needs to happen between Hospital 1 and Hospital 2 about, well, do they need to move residents, or is it that they prefer to move residents? It is something that, again, it's about that local discussion, and there's probably not a straight answer for everything, but I think you'd look at the arrangements, and I think most of you would come to a pretty reasonable outcome, yeah. Yes?
Daniel, what happens at the end of the year, change to employment, say at the end of January, if you're working at a place that's 300 kilometres away, finishing on a Sunday night, you're due to come to work at, say, Eastern Health on a Monday morning. Does this apply in that setting?
In that scenario, are both employment engagements under the Doctors in Training Agreement?
Yes.
I would read it that it would have to be contemplated. Yeah.
But then the doctor would need to tell you that they're at the other, because if they're at a health service that we're not rotating with, if they're working at, I don't know, Albury or somewhere, we don't know that that's what their roster is compared to a rotation, which we do have some control.
Sure, and I think in that set of scenarios, there'd be a number of doctors that would be remaining on for the following year. You would then know who are the doctors that aren't remaining on the following year, and I think it would be about engaging with those doctors in light of this clause, and bearing in mind that sure, this is somewhat separate because the employer is not directing them where to go, but it is about OH&S, it is about safety. I think it's about engaging with that doctor and having that discussion, and then it would be about assessing the OH&S risks associated with that if you're the receiving hospital. Naturally, in that scenario, the obligation is slightly lower than what the clause prescribes because it's not a rotation. But I do think that this clause has a lot of work to do with respect to the change between being at employer 1 and being at employer 2. Yeah. Any further questions with respect to rotations? So we have provided, as I mentioned earlier, there is a podcast that provides a lot of detail with respect to this clause, and we understand it is an item that will require additional assistance once the agreement comes into effect. Clause 32 provides for transition to retirement. We think this will have very little application with respect to doctors in training, but what the clause does provide, it is a common clause that's applied across the Victorian public health sector, and it's been inserted to allow doctors who are transitioning to retirement within the next 5 years to enter into arrangements that reduce their ordinary hours of work, enter into a job share arrangement, work in a position at a lower classification or rate of pay, or another agreed arrangement, but they maintain their value of their accrued long service or annual leave. Now, a request from a doctor for a transition to retirement engagement cannot be unreasonably refused. As it is a common item across the sector, we've prepared a podcast that's available at episode 24. Now, Part D deals with hours of work and related matters. So while maintaining a number of the aspects of the existing ordinary hours of work clause, a number of changes have been made to address claims from AMA with respect to their safe hours of work and fatigue claim. The clause has been amended to reduce the maximum rostered shift length for a registrar to 16 hours per shift. Now that is consistent with all other non-registrar classifications within this agreement, unless an exceptional circumstance exists that requires a greater shift length. What that clause doesn't do, though, is if you roster a doctor for a 14-hour night shift, for example, and you require them to perform overtime, it doesn't mean that they can go home at the 16-hour mark. Not only do you have to consider the OH&S implications of reasonable additional hours, but this doesn't provide an absolute cap that a doctor can work. All it provides is the maximum length of a shift that you can roster a doctor for is 16 hours across this agreement, regardless of their classification. The clause now provides also that a doctor must have 48 hours off duty when transferring from night shift to another shift arrangement. Additionally, the clause provides that a doctor cannot be rostered for more than 7 consecutive night shifts. The clause confirms the capacity for a health service to roster ordinary hours for periods of up to 4 weeks, but clarifies that these arrangements cannot be utilised to reduce or avoid an overtime obligation, such as at any time where rostered hours are worked in excess of ordinary hours or authorised hours are worked in excess of rostered hours. Now, the clause goes some way to dealing with the averaging of ordinary hours of work across a 4-week period. We will deal with that in greater detail with respect to the overtime clause in a couple of slides' time. Clause 33.6, which deals with the breaks between ordinary rostered shifts. Now, the agreement continues to provide that a doctor must be free from duty for at least 10 hours between ordinary rostered shifts. Duty remains undefined. The clause does require health services to develop a procedure that addresses how occupational health and safety considerations are addressed, where they arise as a result of on-call periods, as well as the obligation to arrange work hours in a way that does not cause an excessive or unsafe work pattern to exist. It also encourages a doctor to contact their relevant manager where they've not received a 10-hour break, where it may impact on occupational health and safety. There is no penalty attached to the compliance of this clause. The important takeaway point with respect to this clause is that the health services need to contemplate occupational health and safety risks that arise where a doctor is recalled by telephone during an off-duty period. This is an item that attracted some significant attention in the late stages of bargaining. It was a claim from the AMA that at any phone call during an off-duty period or an on-call period restarts the 10-hour break. Our position is that that is not the case. A doctor may be rostered to perform 2 ordinary shifts on two ordinary shifts across a 2-day period, and between those 2 shifts there may be a 10-hour break. That's consistent with this clause. That doctor may also be on call for that break between those 2 shifts. That is consistent with this clause. What may occur? That doctor might receive 1 phone call at 3 a.m. in the morning with their shift to commence at 6 a.m. the following that morning. Our position is that if a doctor receives 1 phone call during the evening or in the early morning, that shouldn't result in that doctor receiving the 10-hour break starting over again. Our position is that you develop a procedure that deals with how to treat those scenarios, and it may very well be that the example I provided might not result in any change to their start time for the following shift. They may return to work at 6 a.m. The other example would be is if a doctor is on call for that 10-hour break between their 2 shifts, and they're recalled 8 times for half an hour each at multiple times across that evening. In that circumstance, it may be appropriate to change the start time of that doctor, the finishing time of that doctor, or you might not require the doctor to come in at all. But it's not an automatic outcome, and it's resultant on the consideration of what are the actual OH&S risks associated with those engagements. The clause provides an example at the end of the clause, and what that example provides is a number of ways in which this clause can be actioned. One of those is that a doctor may, if they are recalled during the evening, be provided an additional 10 hours to rest and recover after that recall, and these are for telephone recalls only. That is one way to deal with this clause, and is not the only way to deal with this clause. We can encourage our members to, if you haven't already done so, develop a procedure that deals with managing OH&S risks associated with telephone recalls during on-call periods, especially where a doctor may only have 10 hours break between 2 ordinary rostered shifts. Now to move on to a topic that's not very controversial, training time. Now, I said in the first session that I definitely got the short straw when it came to slides, and I think it's more evident in doctors in training. Clause 34 deals with training time. I think we might start out with what has stayed the same. The quantum of training time that's afforded to a registrar, being 5 hours per week for a full-time registrar, remains the same. The menu of what constitutes training time in respect to this agreement remains the same. What we have done, and you would note from the current agreements, training time is spread between the hours of work clause, the rostering clause, the definitions. We've drawn it out of those clauses and provided it its own standalone clause. It's probably an industrial relations example of a squeaky wheel gets the oil, and I think training time has been quite squeaky. The clause does now require a health service to discuss the forms of training time available to the registrar at that health service, and also the most appropriate method of arranging and rostering training time at the commencement of the registrar's employment or rotation. The clause also provides greater flexibility in the arrangement of training time in a manner other than 5 hours per week. And in that circumstance, there has to be a demonstrable benefit to the registrar. But an example of that might be that it may suit your health service to provide a registrar 10 hours of training time per fortnight rather than 5 hours per week, or 20 hours of training time per 4 weeks, and arrange those in blocks of 10 hours or 20 hours or otherwise. It's up to the health service and the registrar to discuss how best it can be applied. The current agreement is quite strict in providing that it's 5 hours per week, and unfortunately there was no way around it. We note that a number of our members had already started engaging in those discussions and arranging them in a manner that suited both the registrar and the health service. So this agreement and the new clause will assist parties in having a legitimised method in doing so. The clause also prescribes that training time can be reallocated where it could not be taken for any reason. And the method by which ordinary hours of work, training time and overtime interact, where training time was unable to be taken, but ordinary work, being clinical work, was performed in lieu of all or a portion of the registrar's training time. Additionally, the clause requires that any change to rostered training time must be recorded in writing by the health service, with that written record being available for inspection. Finally, the clause details that training time must be published on a document that is relied on by all clinical and non-clinical staff within the health service to identify the registrar's hours of work, and this may be a roster or another agreed document. Now, we've got more information on podcast 61 with respect to training time. Now, if you look at the screen, we've got another example, and this example is drawn from clause 34 of the agreement. It details the appropriate payment to be made where a doctor is unable to take their training time when scheduled, and a doctor performs clinical work during this time. In this example, training time was unable to be reallocated in accordance with the clause. Now you can see there that the outcome for this scenario is the doctor should receive 76 hours of pay at the ordinary rate, 10 hours of overtime because they perform clinical work above the ordinary hours, and 10 hours of training time that was rostered but not able to be taken and not able to be reallocated, and that's paid at the ordinary rate of pay. Example 2 provides a scenario where a health service has utilised the ability to reallocate the hours of training time that were unable to be taken. This is a similar example to earlier. They should be paid 76 hours at the ordinary pay rate. 4 hours of training time was able to be taken as rostered, but 6 of those training time hours were overtaken by the need to perform clinical work. So in those 6 hours should be paid at overtime rate because they're doing ordinary clinical work above the 38-hour week. The 6 hours of training time that was rostered but not able to be taken can be reallocated into the following fortnight, and it was reallocated and taken in the following fortnight. So the 6 hours of training time that weren't taken but reallocated aren't paid out in this pay period. It would be moved to the following pay period. And in that pay period, for argument's sake, which will go over a 2-week period, that doctor should receive 16 hours of training time in that fortnight. Is there any questions with respect to training time? Yes?
You knew it would come from.
That's okay.
So going back 2 slides, I know the EBA states that the training is described as an agreement between the doctor and the organisation.
Yep.
surely we can't be expected to change our training time if the registrar disagrees at the start of their rotation.
The clause hasn't been changed with respect to that arrangement. So what is on the menu is prescribed in the menu is non-exhaustive in the agreement. But our reading of the agreement is that a health service can, because the work's being performed in the time that the health service is paying the doctor, then the health service can have the control of directing them as to what is training time. There'll be a menu of what is training time. Our doctor may, if it was applied in that sense as you've described, a doctor could turn around and say, well, I only want to do home study for 5 days a week, and I'll only agree to home study. It's not the intention of the clause. The intention of this clause is to provide the opportunity for additional training to better these doctors. It may be that for a period of their time, for a period of training time, you might agree to home study, where it's nearing a BPT exam or otherwise, but it is at the direction of the health service. The health service is creating the menu locally. The discussion occurs at the commencement. If there is a dispute with respect to what a registrar can utilise, then it would be dealt with in accordance with the dispute resolution clause.
It's also, under the new agreement, it talks about that the health service and registrar must discuss those items.
Yes.
It actually takes it down a notch from the previous agreement.
We snuck that one in.
I know.
I didn't. We'll take ownership of that one. Yes.
The next slide over, the training time couldn't be taken.
Yep.
Was not able to take the training time and performs 10 hours. What happens if that occurs on a regular basis? I.e. the registrar's neglecting to go to training time that's available to them.
Yeah, look, it's a good... I'll give you an answer that's blind to what will probably be said by the registrar, and I'll give you the answer where the registrar says what we expect them to say. It's rostered. So at the start of the rostering period, those periods are not meant for clinical work. The agreement provides that only training time can only be dislodged for a genuine medical emergency or disaster. So if a doctor, at their own discretion, does not attend because they wanted to perform clinical work instead of going to training time, if it doesn't fit within the realm of genuine medical emergency or disaster situation, then they're expected at training time. What I would suggest is if that training time is led by a unit head or by an eminent person within the health service and those registrars or a registrar doesn't attend, there will be nothing wrong with that registrar being asked the following day, where were they? There may be a genuine answer. It may very well have been an absolute genuine answer. This is clarifying the existing entitlements for registrars where they can't take training time because of a genuine medical emergency or disaster situation.
So that's what that example would be?
Yes. This is not where a registrar decides to do something else, other clinical work. It can only be dislodged in those circumstances. The challenge by taking that point, which is provided in black and white in the agreement, is that you should only be dislodging a doctor's rostered training time for him to perform clinical work where it is a genuine medical emergency or disaster situation. We had this discussion with some of our participants in Warrnambool, and they said that they've already tried the discussion about why weren't you there, and you can, as an employer, you can only take it so far before the doctor says, words to the effect of, in my clinical opinion, I needed to stick around. And that becomes not an industrial question. It becomes a discussion between, if it happens regularly, I think it's unlikely that those scenarios consistently come up. If it's a one-off scenario, that's reasonable. But if it's every week that doctor doesn't turn up to their allocated training time because they say there's been a genuine medical emergency or disaster every single week, and your employer is not out of a US sitcom show, I think it's very unlikely that every single week that person's rostered to do training time, especially when the other registrars are able to turn up. So see how it becomes less of a strict industrial question, and it actually really becomes engaging with that doctor, possibly with their unit head or other leader, about saying, this is important, we roster it in advance, we expect you to be there.
with that example though, the way that it's read, there's sort of no mention about emergency
Yeah,
clinical need.
sure.
Can that be incorporated into that particular example?
Well, the example's provided already in the agreement. The agreement is very clear about training time, and it can only be interrupted because of disasters or genuine medical emergencies. The example only provides an example. And as you would appreciate, the training time clause is quite big. And the example can only really, the intention of this was only to clarify how to pay someone if that training time is dislodged, not to talk about how to engage with a doctor who may be gaming the system. We'll move on to overtime. So the AMA have prepared some podcasts and they're available on their YouTube page. And one of their podcasts provides that if you work 45 hours in 1 week and you're a registrar, you should be paid 2 hours of overtime for that week. It can no longer be averaged over a longer time period than that. So the AMA have asserted through some discussions directly with our members during bargaining, but also after the agreement had come into effect, that you will no longer be able to average ordinary hours of work over a 4-week period or over a period of up to 4 weeks. So this also includes those of you that roster 2 weeks, over 2-week periods. The AMA was asserting that overtime comes in where a doctor works in any given week more than 38 hours or more than 43 hours for a registrar. That is not correct, and it is not the correct interpretation of the agreement. The overtime clause is unchanged insofar as that overtime is payable for working rostered hours in excess of ordinary hours, pursuant to the hours of work clause. And the linkage there is deliberate, and the linkage there exists in the current agreement. The current agreement provides that the hours of work clause, which for the new agreement is subclause 33.1, that you can take someone's ordinary hours before you issue the roster and average out those ordinary hours across a 4-week period or across a period of up to 4 weeks in any fashion you wish, contemplating OH&S and safe work considerations, but in any other fashion, you can roster it how you wish. You can put a doctor on, and I'll move to an example in a minute, you can place a doctor on night shift in 1 week where they might perform 70, 80 plus hours in a given 7-day period. That doesn't mean they incur overtime because they've worked more than 38 hours in that week, because you've come out with a roster in advance and provided that that doctor will have an average of 38 hours a week over that 4-week period. The important takeaway though, and this is just really clarifying the existing provisions of the agreement, is that if a doctor does work overtime in accordance with the overtime clause, an example might be that they work an additional shift, it must be paid in the pay period within which it was worked, and it can't be deferred to the following pay period. Now we've provided an example here, and this is more to my example that I was just speaking to, where you have a HMO that over a 4-week period has 152 hours of ordinary work, and that's been rostered over a 4-week period. In week 1 they perform 60 hours, week 2 10 hours, week 3 60 hours, and week 4 22 hours. This HMO doesn't work any other shifts and doesn't work beyond their hours rostered. This HMO is not entitled to overtime. They weren't entitled to overtime in the previous agreement. The agreement with respect to this item is unchanged. They are not entitled to overtime under the new agreement. The correct interaction between ordinary hours of work and overtime is provided here in this example. And this is the same doctor performing the same work, but the doctor obtains an additional shift in week 2 of 10 hours. Now this doctor should be paid 10 hours overtime for that shift worked in that pay period that encompasses week 2. Is there any questions with respect to overtime and the interaction between hours of work? Yes.
Just saying in week 1 and 2, you've got a total of 70 hours.
Yep.
So you're saying you make up the ordinary hours too?
No. So the question was in week 1 and 2, if we take the view that week 1 and 2 is a standalone pay period, whether you have to make up the remaining the remaining 6 hours of their 38-hour per week contract, you wouldn't. And the reason why you don't is that doctor has their ordinary hours of work averaged over a 4-week period. It's for the same reason that in weeks 3 and 4, they'll receive 82 hours of ordinary pay. It's been averaged across a 4-week period, and the doctor does not have to have their week 1 and 2, or that first pay period, lumped up or paid in advance on the following pay period. This is all where you rostered this all in advance. So it would be very clear for that doctor to see that in the first pay period of that month, they would be receiving 70 hours pay. In the second pay period of that month, they'd be receiving 82 hours pay. In both scenarios, overtime isn't payable, but you don't need to lump up the remaining couple of hours that are remaining to bring them up to their 38-hour week or otherwise. Any further questions? There is just some additional changes with respect to part-time and overtime. So the existing overtime clause has been clarified with respect to part-time doctors, that where a part-time doctor is directed by the health service to work rostered hours in excess of their contracted hours, overtime will be paid pursuant to the overtime clause for all hours worked in excess of their contract hours. A doctor who offers to work additional hours would be paid their ordinary rate of pay until their total weekly hours of work exceed the full-time ordinary hours for their classification. Any last questions before we move on to on-call? Again, as I mentioned earlier, I've managed to strike the 3 trickiest topics in Doctors in Training completely by chance.
Sorry,
Yep.
just going back to that previous slide.
Of course.
Where you contracted after 0.5.
Yep.
And part of the roster that they rotate in means that one in so many weeks, they have to do a long day shift, which then pushes them over the 0.5. So in that scenario, we would be paying overtime for that long day shift because it pushes them over their 0.5 hours.
It's a good question. So would this be in the case where it's only for a short period of time, or would it be something that's more ongoing?
So it may be part of the roster
Yeah.
that they rotate into, where one in so many weeks they may have to provide that cover.
I think probably the best industrial act. I think the best way to avoid an overtime obligation which would arise is to have a short-term variation to their contract for that rotation. So there'll be some.
If they're doing this, say, 3 or 4 times in a 13-week period,
Yeah.
would you be suggesting varying that contract 3 or 4 times per term? Per individual?
Would it be predictable when they perform that work? Would it be predictable when it's coming up?
It would be rostered.
Yeah, I think that if you could roster those instances in a fashion where they were probably closer together, it would make sense to vary a contract for a short period of time to encompass those additional hours. But if you don't, and they do work above their contracted hours at the direction of the employer, then they would incur overtime for work that's performed above their contracted hours, yes. With respect to on-call, to make it easier with respect to the new provisions, I want you to completely forget about the terms and the ways that on-call were defined in the previous agreement. Now the reason being, and I'm happy to take ownership of this, is that general on-call in the new agreement is the old telephone on-call, and standby on-call in the new agreement is the old general on-call. So I think what we've taken in this agreement is to provide greater detail as to what fits within these different forms of on-call. And the clause provides for general on-call that an on-call period where the doctor is rostered to hold themselves available to provide clinical advice by telephone and or to be recalled to their usual place of work. So these are doctors who are rostered to essentially provide continuity of clinical care, not someone who is predominantly on call to replace someone who calls in sick. Standby on-call is an on-call period where the doctor is rostered to hold themselves available solely for the purpose of returning to the health service in circumstances such as replacing unplanned absences or to address a clinical need. But the standby on-call provision cannot be utilised for a doctor that's expected to provide advice by telephone. So there's a clear distinction there that if you require a doctor solely to be replacing a doctor who is maybe calling in sick, they're not there to provide continuity of clinical care, but they might be recalled if someone calls in sick, then they would be paid your standby on-call rate. The general on-call would be reserved for a doctor who may be providing continuity of care through the evening and overnight, who may be providing clinical advice by telephone, but also may be recalled if it's clinically necessary.
So if they get recalled, they get that on-call payment?
Sorry, in what circumstance? So the question was, can you just clarify?
So if they're actually on the, just the telephone,
The general, if they're on general on-call?
and then for whatever reason they actually have to come in.
Yep.
Does that on-call general payment have to stand by?
No, so the question was, if a doctor is on general on-call and required to return to the workplace, what do they revert to a standby on-call rate? And then also, what's the correct recall payment? So the agreement actually provides a higher rate for general on-call. And so did the previous agreement for telephone on-call. So general on-call is a higher rate, and the reason why is it actually requires the doctor to be ready and available really for the whole shift. And it's likely that that doctor will be recalled by telephone throughout the entirety of that shift. The standby on-call is solely at the start, before that doctor goes on-call or leaves for the evening. That doctor should know whether they're standby, which means if I called in sick, then they're going to get recalled. In that circumstance, then it would just be standby on call. In both circumstances, the recall rates are the same. They're paid at overtime rates. So if you're on general on call and it's clinically necessary for you to return physically to the workplace, you're paid a physical recall, the same as if you are on standby on call and your colleague calls in sick and you're recalled to come into the health service. Both circumstances, you're paid the same recall overtime rates are paid for the work performed.
Just to
Yes.
clarify that, Daniel, so the standby on call, if you call someone in to replace the shift, that wouldn't be paid as recall though?
So if you know in advance that someone's going to be sick and you're replacing an absence, then it would depend, because technically if they're working above their rostered hours of work, then that's overtime.
Yeah, so we're applying the overtime, not the recall.
Correct. Yep. Yeah. So for example, if you know that a doctor is going to be absent on Friday night, and you call another doctor to replace that shift, that doctor should get paid overtime if that's in addition to their rostered hours. But they're not. Even if they were meant to be on call, well, they're not on call anymore. The on-call rate becomes payable where they move into that on-call period, not where it's rostered in advance, but then that gets changed. It kind of becomes more of a change of roster arrangement, because they're performing that, that person's going to be absent. So they're no longer holding themselves available at home. They're actually performing clinical work.
So let's say if you've got them rostered on call, now it's a weekday, and the doctor's rostered on call for Sunday.
Yep.
Someone calls in sick Sunday morning, you've called the on-call doctor in to do the shift.
Yep.
So picture you pay that as the overtime shift, whatever the period is, do we still pay the on-call payment?
So the doctor was recalled and they started the shift?
Yeah.
Yes. So for example, if the shift was meant to start at 10 p.m. and at 10:01, or 10 to 10, or sorry, 10 past 10, that the doctor's not turning up, then sure, the doctor's entering into that on-call period and they should receive both. But it's them holding themselves available. I think that's a really important part of this clause, is they're required to hold themselves available. I think there is a distinction between knowing in advance that someone's going to call in sick and you have time to change their roster in advance. That's different to knowing half an hour before a shift starts that a doctor is sick. That doctor had been holding themselves available to be on call that night. I think in that circumstance, they would get the on-call benefit plus the recall benefit. Yeah. Any further questions with respect to on-call? So clause 41 deals with workload management and review. This is the same clause as provided in the doctors in training clause. And again, it aligns with the AMA's claim to address safe hours of work. Parts of the previous work practice review clause have been incorporated into this standalone clause. It provides for the safe assignment of work, consultation about workload, the capacity for workload to be reviewed, and ability for disputes to be dealt with in accordance with the dispute resolution clause. I'll now hand over to Stuart, who will talk to Part E.
All right, Part E, remuneration and the recovery of overpayments. Just out of interest, how many people are here from payroll? Mostly you've all sat together. I'm not sure what that says. Just a reminder that we have a new payroll reference group. We've been running a small group of payroll people and having meetings with that group for a while now, but we're just expanding that out as of this month. The idea that will be that we have a regular, predictable opportunity to engage with payroll people. One of the things we've been really mindful of is that oftentimes payroll inherit outcomes after they've already been reached and don't necessarily get a chance to have input at the front. What we're hoping is that by having a regular opportunity to engage with our payroll members, that can start to change. So there'll be a bulletin with respect to that shortly, but would certainly encourage people from payroll to participate in that group. All right, clause 42. Pretty straightforward in terms of wage increases, 3% per annum for 4 years from the first full pay period on or after 1st of January 18, 19, 20 and 21. Like the specialists agreement, it also provides for a 6% uplift from 1 January 2018, and just like the specialists, the last increase for this group had been in December 2015. By now, members will have received the hospital circular from the department authorising the payment of the 6% and will have doubtless prepared the 3% increase in wages for salaries and allowances once the agreement is approved and operating after it's approved by the Fair Work Commission. This group also has a lump sum payment. It is a payment of $2,000 and for those who are employed as of 1 January 2018. Generally speaking, the employer of the doctor as of 1 January 2018 is responsible for that payment. There is a bulletin that goes through some scenarios, which is bulletin 2297. In preparing that bulletin, we consulted both with the department and the AMA. We do acknowledge that this is one example where the time delay does present some challenges because this group is quite mobile. So we'll be preparing some additional material with regards to how to navigate the fact of really the affluction of time and the fact that how to engage and sort out payments for those people who have moved somewhere else. Similarly with the specialists, one of the things that we do need to be mindful of, those people who were employed as of 1 January 2018, who are no longer employed as of the date the agreement comes into operation, who are in effect taking self-managed parental leave. Those are the people that we just need to keep an eye on in a sense and deal with on a case-by-case basis. It's a phenomenon that is particularly acute for this group and not for others, but it is something that we said we would work through on a case-by-case basis. Clause 46, the recovery of overpayments. Really this provides support for the Financial Management Act 1994, sets out a process by which you advise the doctor in writing of both the quantum and how the overpayment occurred, that the parties meet with the objective of reaching agreement as to whether or not, as a matter of fact, an overpayment has happened. There are limits with regards to the amounts that can be deducted through the Financial Management Act. From memory, I think under these circumstances, the doctor does have a right to petition the minister directly for relief. I'm not sure that that happens particularly often, and I hold concerns for the person who decides to do that. But Part F, education and professional development, including the CME allowance, internal training and examination and conference leave. The existing clause for CME allowance has been amended to provide that it is payable on a pro rata basis for casual employees in limited circumstances. Those limited circumstances are for casual doctors replacing a person for a specific term for a period of a fortnight or more. It is limited to that circumstance. The entitlement to receive CME for full-time and part-time doctors remains unchanged, save that the amount is increased. Internal training, where compulsory training is to be undertaken, it should be in paid time. That is a fairly standard industrial principle. Where it occurs during paid time, it does give you control. It is not an unusual thing, but it is something we've included expressly in this agreement. This does not amend the amount of examination leave, the quantum available to a doctor, but it has been amended to allow a doctor to access examination leave where it's necessary to obtain a relevant qualification as defined within the clause, so a slight broadening of the scope. It also clarifies that a health service should provide at least 3 clear days examination leave immediately prior to each examination. Primarily the difference here, other than that slight change in scope, is in the setting out. Broadly it remains as it was. Similarly, this has been rewritten to remove ambiguity rather than fundamentally change the clause. It does provide that a doctor must apply for conference seminar leave by 31 March of the year in which the leave will be taken, or otherwise with not less than 3 months' notice. Part G contains allowances and reimbursement, including higher duties. And with respect to higher duties, it clarifies the conditions and benefits for doctors who are required to fulfil the full duties of a registrar. The way in which that's been clarified is that those people who are acting as a registrar are to be required or treated as a registrar for all purposes. This is particularly relevant in the context of the hours of work. That is, if you have somebody acting as a registrar, they have a 43-hour week made up of 38 hours plus the 5 hours training time. It cannot be that somebody acting as a registrar is required to do 43 hours of ordinary time. That was a matter that has been the subject of dispute during the life of the previous agreement. It is dealt with and made unambiguous under the new agreement. Clause 52.1, location allowance. This is payable now to a doctor who is required to move residence. The previous test concerned the distance to the Melbourne GPO as being the relevant test. Does anybody know where the Melbourne GPO currently is?
It doesn't exist.
A lot of answers there, which suggests that making this change was a really good idea. I think the Melbourne GPO, what was the Melbourne GPO, is currently being occupied by H&M. So, creating a circumstance where an HMO would be measured in terms of their distance from H&M, in terms of their allowance for location allowance. A different test. Same principle, but a different test, where somebody is required to move residence is where that location allowance now applies. It also is a little bit of a signpost as to the way that our sector is changing in terms of the role of regional health services as well.
Just ask, sorry, the location. Is it one set payment, or are they going to send us a bill for, storage and transport costs for all the furniture and things like that, or is it just a one set fee? It's taxable.
Ooh, 2 different questions. Is it taxable and is it one set fee? I can see that what I can see and that you can't see from where you are is that Daniel is busy scrolling through the agreement. He's picked the wrong agreement. Just dealing with those in time. I guess the issue of the tax component is whether it's a reimbursement for a cost incurred potentially, or whether it's income. But as always with any tax matter, comes with a disclaimer that we don't give tax advice and to always speak to your accountant. So just in terms of 52.1 and the location allowance and how it's applied.
So it's a fixed rate that's prescribed as an allowance in the back of the agreement.
Fixed rate?
And it's paid per week. Location allowance is, as of the 1st of January 2018, $43.10 per week. So it would attract both taxation, and it's not an invoice model, it would just be a fixed allowance.
Okay, so it's not a reimbursement, it is a fixed amount prescribed in the back of the agreement, but on a per week basis. Okay, thank you, Daniel. Moving to Part H, public holidays, leave and related matters, covering replacement of doctors on leave, fitness for work, annual personal parental long service leave and other leave types, as well as family violence leave. Clause 59 concerns the replacement of doctors, and the existing provisions have been amended to clarify that a health service is required to replace a doctor who is absent on leave where, if not replacing the doctor, will result or likely result in an unreasonable workload. Workload is one of the key themes with respect to this agreement. The clause does not require automatic replacement. What it does is require you to actively consider workload issues, and effectively you have a choice. You can take measures to manage the workload in terms of determining what must be done and what must not be done, or does not yet need to be done, or to make decisions about replacement. But it's about the application of a principle. The existing provision talks about consultation with regards to workload. This is trying to underpin it with a tangible principle. Clause 60, annual leave. This has been amended to comply with the NES. The agreement clarifies that when calculating the annual leave payable to a doctor, the doctor must not be paid less than their base rate of pay for the doctor's ordinary hours in the period of paid annual leave. The agreement reiterates that annual leave may be taken for a period agreed between the health service and the doctor. It also details a process by which a doctor applies for annual leave, what obligations the health service has in responding and consulting on alternative leave dates. The clause further provides that a request for annual leave must not be unreasonably refused, and that annual leave, once approved, must not be unilaterally changed by the employer. Annual leave for this group is generally a very organised thing. The agreement does provide that a health service may propose its preferred timing for the taking of annual leave by a doctor to suit its operational requirements and to ensure that all doctors are given an opportunity to take their annual leave within the year in which it is accrued. The effect of the changes are twofold, one of which is to ensure NES compliance, but the second of which is to acknowledge the fact that whilst annual leave is a very organised thing for doctors in training to ensure that everybody gets a chance to take their annual leave, that there is a need, in order to be compliant with the NES, to be responsive to people who are seeking an alternative time for their annual leave. There may be a million different reasons as to why somebody may want to change the timing of annual leave from a time that you have proposed. Somebody who decides to get married or some other significant life event may seek to take annual leave at a time other than the time that you suggested. What it requires is that you engage with that person and be responsive to those requests. Similarly, clause 61, personal leave, has been amended to meet the obligations under the NES, clarifying that when calculating personal leave payable to a doctor, the doctor must not be paid less than the doctor's base rate of pay for the doctor's ordinary hours of work in the period of paid personal carer's leave. There is another change here which goes again to this issue of the intersection between parental leave and fixed-term employment. So this agreement, like a lot of agreements, provides that people can take their personal leave from one employer to another. The change that's occurred here concerns where the employment comes to an end for reasons associated with parental leave. Specifically, it provides the ability to transfer up to 168 days of accumulated personal leave where there is a break between two health services or community health centre, where the doctor was absent from employment due to the birth or adoption of a child, for a period consistent with long parental leave, and provided that the doctor gives evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person as to the reason for the break employment, that the reason was consistent with the reason in the clause. We are seeking to remedy the disadvantage that would otherwise arise. Really what this provision does is put those people whose employment contracts lapse during a period of parental leave in the same position as everybody else. It is not unusual to have an ability to take your personal leave from one employer to another. This is simply seeking to remedy an anomaly. All right, at that point, I'm going to hand over to Daniel. Fitness for Work, I know it's one of his favourites. I think during the bargaining, we often refer to this as Witness the Fitness, in tribute to the Woods Manoeuvre song, which mystified, I think, the AMA at the time, just as it has you. But I'll hand over to Daniel. As he's coming to stage, I would like to thank again Eastern Health for hosting today. It's been really excellent to have this facility available. But Daniel will take us through the last part of this agreement. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Stuart. So clause 62, again, it's a common fitness for work clause that's been modelled on similar clauses utilised in the Victorian public health sector. It provides an open and transparent process in circumstances where the doctor's manager forms a reasonable belief that the doctor may be unfit to perform their duties. In addition, it clarifies the requirement for the employer to make reasonable adjustments where the doctor has either a permanent or temporary disability. So that details further and sets out the obligations prescribed in the Equal Opportunity and Disability Discrimination Acts. We provided a podcast with respect to this clause, and that's available at episode 20. With respect to public holidays, the clause has been clarified with respect to the entitlement applicable to doctors that are at full-time basis, where public holidays occur on their rostered day off or other day off. In accordance with the National Employment Standards, these doctors are entitled to 1 day's ordinary pay. It ensures compliance with the National Employment Standards with respect to the interaction between annual leave, personal leave and public holidays. And there are other changes which include the substitution of religious public holidays, which involves, subject to the ongoing operational needs of the health service, a doctor may, with the prior agreement of the health service, substitute a public holiday as defined within this clause with a nominated religious holiday that is not a defined public holiday. Compassionate leave is an existing entitlement within the current agreement. The proposed agreement does not change the quantum of the entitlement for someone accessing compassionate leave, but it does better define permissible occasion in accordance with the National Employment Standards. It prescribes that a permissible occasion to access compassionate leave is where a member of the doctor's immediate family or a member of the doctor's household contracts or develops a personal illness that poses a serious threat to his or her life, sustains a personal injury that poses a serious threat to his or her life, or that person dies. Prenatal leave is a new clause, and it provides that a doctor can access his or her personal leave credits in order to attend prenatal appointments or parenting classes that are only available or can only be attended during the doctor's ordinary rostered shift. This is a common prenatal leave clause that is consistent with the remaining Victorian public health sector agreements. Pre-adoption leave is an existing entitlement, but has now been provided its own clause. So without amending the existing entitlements, it has been provided its own clause and provides that a doctor seeking to adopt a child is, on the production of satisfactory evidence if required, entitled to unpaid leave for the purpose of attending any interviews or examinations necessary to the adoption procedure. Parental leave has been replaced with a common clause utilised across the remainder of the Victorian public health sector. It retains and builds upon the current and existing parental leave entitlements by removing gender-related terms with respect to paid parental leave for a primary carer. It incorporates the various obligations that exist in relation to pregnancy and adoption, and it ensures compliance with the National Employment Standards. The long service leave clause has been amended for the flexible taking of long service leave and a greater period of absence for up to 2 years for the purpose of parental leave without breaking continuity of service. As mentioned this morning, the reason for the introduction of that clause is to ensure that a doctor who is accessing his or her statutory entitlement under the Fair Work Act to extend their parental leave period for a period of up to 2 years doesn't have their leave continuity impacted by accessing that entitlement. So this ensures that a doctor who is absent on unpaid parental leave for up to 2 years doesn't lose their continuity, it doesn't contribute to service, but it does not break service. Clause 71 deals with family violence leave, and again, this is a clause that has been introduced into every Victorian public health sector agreement since the nurses EBA in 2016. It utilises the definition of family violence as prescribed in the Family Violence Protection Act 2008, and it provides for the development of internal support arrangements for doctors experiencing or supporting someone experiencing family violence. It provides for 20 days paid leave for doctors experiencing family violence, the ability for a doctor assisting someone experiencing family violence to access their accrued personal leave for that purpose. As I mentioned earlier, the clause has been modelled on the existing Victorian public health sector agreement clauses. So we've provided 2 podcasts, one at episode 42, which deals with user notes for family violence leave, and episode 58 which provides for the strengthening of hospital responses to the Family Violence Initiative. Part I deals with accommodation and facilities. The existing facilities on rotation clause has been amended to provide for the provision of a safe living environment, which includes an obligation to perform safety assessments of residential living quarters. Safety assessments will consider matters including but not limited to any equipment, appliances or furniture, hygiene and cleanliness, and security, including any security risks associated from isolated or shared accommodation. Additionally, the rotation hospital will advise the doctor in writing on how to access Wi-Fi and technical support contacts. And in the absence of Wi-Fi, the rotation hospital will advise the doctor in writing of the reason as to why it is not available and what alternative arrangements for internet access exist. We have provided a specific podcast for this clause itself at episode 65. Is there any questions with respect to facilities while on rotation? Clause 74 provides a common breastfeeding clause that's been inserted into all the Victorian public health sector agreements. It provides clearer rights associated with breastfeeding in the first year following birth. It includes a provision of a paid break to express milk or to breastfeed, provision of a place to express or feed, and the appropriate storage facilities. Part J is Union Matters and the Service Delivery Partnership Plan. So the Union Matters Clause is a common Union Matters Clause that's been modelled on the Victorian Public Health Sector Agreement Union Matters Clause, and it clarifies and simplifies the rights of the AMA and ASMOF, their delegates, HSRs, and doctors that hold AMA and ASMOF elected positions. There is more information with respect to the Union Matters Clause as a broad sector-wide approach at episode 17. Clause 77 provides for the Service Delivery Partnership Plan. So the Victorian Government wage policy provides a guaranteed 2.5% per annum wage increase with the opportunity to reach service delivery partnership outcomes to provide an additional 0.5% per annum wage increase. The parties for this agreement have reached an agreement on a list of matters, of which incorporate some items that are common across the sector, and this would include flu vaccination and items pertaining to patient flow. But there are specific items pertaining to just doctors in training and doctors as a cohort. There is information available at episode 44, which deals with the Service Delivery Partnership Plan working groups. The specific items pertaining to doctors in training and medical specialists include collaboration to reduce training and promote recognition of training across health services, the monitoring of onboarding and credentialing practices with a view to move to electronic onboarding and credentialing, the joint monitoring through this centralised group of the implementation of training time for registrars, a fatigue management review, which will be incorporated into the medical specialists as well, which terms of reference have to be agreed within the 6 months of the commencement of the agreement, and a joint working party, which has been established to identify how and when 2-year contracts can be accommodated within the existing classification structure. So the parties would remember we spoke to our reference group at length about the AMA's claim for 2-year contracts as a minimum across the sector, and it was identified very clearly that, at least in our current system and the way that we rely upon the transition of doctors, but also how they interact with colleges and other institutions, is that would be very difficult, borderline impossible. So that group will be to identify how it can be achieved, and it may very well only be achieved in a very small number of classifications under this agreement. We have performed a specific podcast for the Service Delivery Partnership Plan items for the Doctors EBA, and this is at episode 69. Schedule A prescribes a list of employers and health services covered by this agreement. Schedule B provides for the wages and allowances. You'll note, for those of you that have been looking at the existing agreement, the wages and allowances were spread across about 10 odd pages. This provides it in a simplified table, which is consistent with our other agreements, which we've received some very positive feedback with respect to. Schedule C provides a revised template certificate of service, which deals with transfer of accrued personal carers leave and long service leave clauses. With respect to more information, so those of you would note that items such as the lump sum guide and guidances with respect to the implementation guide have been issued by Bulletin. We also have been producing a number of podcasts and have a number in the pipeline with respect to both medical specialists and doctors in training. It notes there the Doctors in Training Implementation Guide, which sets out guidance how to implement the new clauses as we've discussed today. We also have developed an implementation tracker, which lists some of the issues and some of the challenges which we've heard from you, and through our forums and through our discussions with our reference group about items that are troublesome or tricky to implement. We've listed them as implementation items to be tracked and to be worked through between the parties and reported back every month to our ER and IR directors in the metropolitan and regional meetings. We also have the VHIA community app. As Stuart mentioned at the start, if you are not on the app, our website provides guidance on how to become a member of the app. If you experience any trouble, please contact the officers and we can arrange for some greater assistance to be provided. That concludes the Doctors in Training presentation. Was there any final questions with respect to Doctors in Training? Okay, well, to echo Stuart, thank you very much to Nikki and the team here at Eastern for hosting us, and thank you all for coming from far and wide. Thank you.